The Cross and the Resurrection by Whiley. In the 24th chapter of Luke's Gospel, we read about the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. They were walking along with downcast faces, discussing what had happened to Jesus. When Jesus drew alongside them and asked, "What are you discussing?" they replied, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem, that you don't know the things that have happened there in these days?" It is about these things that happened that I want to talk about briefly this morning. Jesus explained to them from Moses and the prophets that he, the Messiah, had to suffer these things and then enter glory. The Apostle Paul, wherever he went, if there was a synagogue there, he would go there first and reason with his fellow countrymen, the Jews, from the Scriptures, that Jesus was the Messiah, that he was crucified and rose from the dead 3 days later. Invariably, they rejected his message, although some believed. He would then go to the Gentiles, the non-Jews, and take the message to them that Jesus, the Son of God, was crucified, dead, and buried, and rose from the dead 3 days later. This was his basic message, and one might say his only message. He wrote to the Corinthians, "I resolved to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." And it was the same wherever Paul went. These things that happened in those 3 days, about 2,000 years ago, comprise the most momentous event in the history of the universe. The whole universe revolves around this event. These things that happened. Everything that went before and all that came after point to this one event, these things that happened. It is the greatest, most wonderful, most fantastic, most awesome, most spectacular, most terrific, most stupendous, most magnificent, and most any other superlative you can say about it, event in the history of the universe. It is, in fact, his story. It was for these things that happened that the whole universe was created. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, we read, "For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him." They were created for him that he might be born of a woman and live among us, and like us, and then be subjected to a mockery of a trial, be struck and punched, spit upon, and have his hair and beard pulled out, mercilessly whipped until his flesh was raw, then stripped naked and nailed to a cross to die. He died and was buried, and 3 days later rose from the dead. All this for you and for me, that if we believe in him, we might go to heaven. It was necessary for these things to happen. Otherwise no one would ever get to heaven, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. You see, if Adam and Eve had never sinned, and no one else either, they would all still be alive, because sickness and death only came as the result of sin. And if no one died, how would we get to heaven? Now, as much as it would be great to live in a world without sin, no wars, no crime, all peaceful and loving, and no weeds and thistles in the garden, it is nowhere near as good as heaven. And even if God had set a time limit on our lives and said, "After 100 years you will die and come to heaven," we would then boast that we had got there through our own righteousness and detract from the glory due to God. And God will never give his glory to another. Not only that, but boasting is pride, and so we would immediately be kicked out of heaven, like Satan was. So God created us with a free will to choose between good and evil, knowing that we would choose evil and die. And then at just the right time, Jesus would come to die for us. Hebrews chapter 9 verse 27 says that just as a man is destined once to die and then the judgment, or as the Authorized Version says, it is appointed once for man to die and then the judgment, each and every one, with no exceptions, has to keep that appointment. But for born-again Christians, that appointment brings no terror. I say born again because not all who call themselves Christians are Christians. Jesus says in Matthew 7 verse 22, "Many will come in that day and say, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons and do miracles in your name?" And Jesus will reply, "Away from me, you evildoers, I never knew you." It is knowing Jesus that matters, not knowing about him. As Jesus told Nicodemus, no one can see the kingdom of heaven unless they are born again. So when the born-again believer arrives at the appointed time, Jesus will be there with open arms to say, "Welcome, my friend, come in, your mansion is ready and waiting." John's Gospel also says, "Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God." You see, all who have been born again, when that day comes, God will see Jesus standing there in their place. Our sins were put on him, and therefore he died, and his righteousness or goodness was put on us, and therefore we live. His resurrection is proof to us that we will rise and live with him for all eternity. Isaiah chapter 61 verse 10 says, "He has clothed us with a garment of salvation and arrayed us in a robe of righteousness." Have you got that garment of salvation and robe of righteousness? If not, I pray that you will attend to it without delay. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians chapter 6 verse 2 says, "Now is the day of God's favour. Today is the day of salvation." Attend to it today, dear friends. Or as it says in Hebrews chapter 2 verse 3, "How shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation?" Paul's message was Jesus crucified and risen from the dead, these things that happened. And it is my message also. That is Brian's message, although not explained so well as Paul explained it. Please attend to these things that happened, and God bless you all. Amen.